My dad found me in hysterics the following morning. He forced me to calm down and explain what I was rambling about.
"Son, just tell me what happened,"
he said calmly. Tracy said the Needleman was in the Grisha neighbourhood and was going to go looking for him. He hasn't responded to my calls or messages since then. I showed him the picture of Tracy's map from my phone. He stared at it for a bit.
"I'll call some of the force over there. Where were you before you went out looking for him?"
The Tat on the east side of campus. My dad ran his finger across the picture of the map.
That walk would basically take him across campus. He could have been captured anywhere between those 2 points.
I hadn't thought about that. I assumed that he had made it to the neighbourhood.
"Do you know for sure if it was related to the Needleman?"
My dad asked as he began to pace the living room, staring at the picture on my phone. What else could it be? You saw how obsessed Tracy was with finding him, and the one night he actually goes out to look for him, he disappears. My dad nodded and said softly,
"Christian, you should have told me about this last night. We could have sent officers with him."
My eyes teared up as I was hit with guilt. I know, Dad, but he told me he didn't want the law involved so he could get revenge himself. My dad nodded.
"Understood, son. I am going to get all this information to the police as soon as possible. We'll find Tracy. I promise."
The next few weeks seemed to crawl by. News of Tracy's disappearance began to spread like wildfire, and several city rules were created as part of an emergency mandate. For one, all citizens without prior approval would need to be inside by 8 p.m. For minors, it was 7. Citizens were also instructed to walk in at least groups of 2. The campus was littered with both officers and the National Guard. They had been called in a week after Tracy's disappearance. My dad, startled by how close I was to encountering the Needleman, hired a plainclothes officer to escort me to and from school. A 230-pound ex-Marine named Sergei. His menacing presence made most people keep their distance, the exception being Jenna and Pat. My loss of freedom was not even on my mind, just the mystery of how Tracy vanished without a trace. There was no evidence of a struggle anywhere on his planned route across campus. Detectives began to suspect that he didn't even make it all the way to Grisha, since Hampton Street was far closer to the coffee shop and was a much easier scapegoat. Hampton Street became another hotbed for police activity. Their presence was felt around the area, and I knew of several arrests being made. None, however, gave us any more information about the Needleman. My family, as well as Jenna and Pat, were a crucial support system during this time. They made sure I was taking care of myself and provided much-needed company. I could tell they both were shocked as well at Tracy's disappearance, but were trying to stay positive for my sake. "No sign of any struggle might be a good thing," Jenna said one day on our walk to the campus game room. The 3 of us, Pat, myself and Sergei, did a double take at this comment. "I mean, there's just no evidence that something bad happened. I don't know. It's just a thought," she continued, colour draining from her voice. "Yeah, I suppose that could be," I agreed, with little enthusiasm.
"Any news from the FBI, Sergei?"
Pat inquired. He looked over his shoulders with suspicion and responded quietly.
"We might have a lead. Can you guys keep this to yourselves?"
The 3 of us nodded.
They didn't find a link between Percy and Rebecca, but there was one between their parents. Both of them worked for the same hospital several years ago. "Don't tell anyone this information, okay?" he hissed as we neared the DU Student Centre. Our eyes moved upwards to see his hardened frown. We nodded again. Click, clack, click, clack, click. Several circles of couches, as well as many rows of tables, lined the perimeter of the well-lit game room. Jenna sat on one of the couches, absent-mindedly doodling in a notebook. Sergei was sitting on a table, pretending to read a book, while his eyes circled the room like a hawk. The middle of the room was reserved for a few pool and ping-pong tables, one of which we were playing on. The closest wall to us had a large TV, which happened to be playing a one-on-one interview with none other than Mayor Thomas O'Brien. I watched the orange ping-pong ball pass Pat's paddle and bounce on the laminate floor as his attention became fixated on my dad. Joining us right here is Doyle Mayor Thomas O'Brien. Thank you for joining us, Thomas.
Thank you for taking some time to speak with me, Sandra.
I see my dad's carefully crafted sitting posture and demeanour as he begins to answer Sandra's questions. He was wearing a sleek black suit and had his mid-length brown hair perfectly styled, without the beard he was previously growing out. He looked almost identical to me. I nervously scanned the room for a TV remote in case the interview went downhill. Also, checking to see any change in expression on Pat's face. His face remained stoic, eyes still glued to the screen. Other people in the room also started to tune in to the interview. We wanted to address a few common questions many citizens have been asking. First of all, I wanted to address the fact that the city of Doyle has had and continues to have a serious drug problem. You have been re-elected as mayor partially due to your promise to create and implement a pragmatic approach to rehabilitation. She read his words off of her page. It has been a few months since the election, and many residents do feel these words were simply lip service.
Thank you for addressing these concerns, Sandra,
my dad replied in the emphatic, sincere tone of a media-trained politician.
First of all, yes, I understand these concerns, and we have been working tirelessly to implement just that. Just last week, my team and I implemented a policy to drastically reduce the amount of jail time one faces when caught with small amounts of both heroin and other opioid substances. We are also currently working with medical and law enforcement resources from the Quincy Medical Center in order to utilize their world-class methadone clinic to help with treatment.
Sandra nodded slowly. I understand, Thomas. This still brings up the question, why has Doyle been so slow to help treat this problem at the root? Heroin has been decriminalized for years in every neighboring city. Why are we also forced to have addicts travel almost 7 miles to Quincy without any reliable transportation infrastructure to get them there? Why do we not have any rehabilitation resources here in Doyle? I cringed as I watched the grilling proceed. My dad tried to appear calm, but I could tell he was flustered. My serve, right? I said as I hit another ping-pong ball towards Pat, just to see it bounce past him again. The remote was still nowhere to be seen. I could see Jenna in the corner of my view, looking at the TV as well. Sergei wasn't bothered as he continued to read his book.
I understand that there is still work to be done, and we are making sure to prioritise key opportunities over the next 4 years.
Our next question. Based on several independent news sources, you have been reported to have close ties with a few big pharmaceutical manufacturers, specifically the company Syringe, which is now America's leading producer of both oxycodone and buprenorphine. We can't help but to feel that part of this drug crisis was facilitated by those very companies and the gateway opioids they provided to our citizens.
I can assure you, Sandra, that information is both dated and grossly blown out of proportion. Any policies my team and I enacted around Syringe and other pharmaceutical companies was strictly to get the most effective painkillers into our pharmacies, hospitals, and dental clinics. We fully trust the authority of Doyle's medical staff to safely dose these drugs based on patient needs.
Pat was now a few steps closer to the screen. I could tell by his frown that he was not happy with my dad's answers. Hey, Pat, is everything good? I called. He gave me a quick, expressionless nod and returned his attention to the screen.
Our final question is one that many people are likely waiting for. It seems like when things can't get any worse, the Needleman started to purposely create drug addicts. What can you do to stop the Needleman before he attacks someone else? We have another person recently reported missing, again, tied to the Needleman attacks. We have been forced to hide in our homes, patiently waiting for more information. When will we hear more about this from city leaders? Where is the progress on the search for the Needleman? By this point, Pat resembled a kid watching Saturday morning cartoons, his head a foot away from the screen. My dad, however, was looking like he had aged a decade since the beginning of the interview.
Thank you for bringing that up, Sandra. We are trying to gain as much knowledge as possible on the Needleman and will put him behind bars. We have involved the FBI in order to trace a link between his string of attacks and help us find his next attack before it even happens. Until then, law enforcement resources have been more vigilant than ever. Officers have been placed in schools, colleges, hospitals, neighbourhood entrances, and especially areas with high drug activity.
Do you mean to suggest the Needleman may be one of the addicts living on Hampton Street in southeast Doyle? Sandra asked, eyebrows raised.
We do not have a definite answer, but it is certainly possible. They would have the means and potentially even the motive to do it.
He turns to the camera.
The Needleman, wherever you are hiding, we will find you, and you will face the consequences of your atrocities.
I walked up to the TV and pressed the channel down button on its side. A baseball player now occupied my dad's old real estate on the screen. Pat's trance broke as he slowly looked back at me. I had a feeling that I knew what he was thinking. Has Doyle always had such a shitty response to the drug problem, and how much of that was Mr. O'Brien's fault? He finally spoke after a bit.
Has Doyle always had such a shitty response to the drug problem?
He left out the last part, but I knew he was thinking it. Why else would he ask me? Yeah, I agreed reluctantly. It was like this when my dad became mayor. He nodded solemnly. I'm sorry, Pat. I imagine the pain he might have been able to avoid if his family had better access to treatment.
It's not your fault, man. You don't make the rules.
I couldn't help but to hear a touch of resentment in his voice. Dad, what the fuck was that? I said in an exasperated tone as he walked into the house.
Don't use that language in this house, Christian,
he scolded. I didn't back down. How come you didn't tell me about these ties to Cityan? And didn't we talk about Hampton Street already? There is no chance you're going to find the Needleman there. I showed you Tracy's notes, Dad. He is in Grisha. He dropped his work bag and sighed as he rubbed his eyes.
Son, do you know the first thing about being the mayor of a major city? I have a million things going on at all times. I'm not a detective, and I'm not on the Needleman case. They told me Hampton Street is a place of interest, so that's what I'm going with.
But Tracy said...
I'm sorry, but it doesn't matter what Tracy said, my dad interrupted. Tracy's not a detective, nor is he in the FBI. They have their protocols, and that's what we're going by.
He continued.
And that Cityan deal was in place long before my time.
Do you think it's contributed to the drug problem in Doyle? He paused.
Look, it's complicated. I don't know. Look, Christian, I got another call coming up, and I gotta go.
He took off his shoes and hurried upstairs. Days turned into weeks as the search continued for any evidence of the Needleman to Tracy's whereabouts. I was beginning to lose hope of ever finding him. It was May by the time I heard any news, mostly snippets of information, either from my dad or through Sergei as he escorted me to and from classes.
We have a bit of information,
he told me one day after my final statistics class of the semester.
It's not much, but it could be something. So, Percy and Rebecca had a common link. Both of their mums worked at the same hospital at the same time. They said that both of them also shared a few patients, including our person of interest, Celia Duff. You think she might be the one with a grudge against them? She died 20 years ago. Look, it's not much, but a motive could be forming here. Just stay hopeful. This case might be over soon.
His hardened face nodded and gave me a small smile. Sergei was right. Just a few days later, the Needleman was captured. Again, Sergei was the one to deliver the news. We saw his mouth drop as he read a message on his phone.
Holy shit, they caught him!
I stood up from my chair and yelled, a little too loud for the library. No fucking way! How'd you know? Did they find Tracy? It felt like most of the library heard me, and excited whispering started to pop up around the large room. Jenna and Pat were similarly excited. We exchanged hugs and began badgering Sergei with questions.
Just give me a second, guys,
Sergei said, poorly disguising his excitement as he picked up his phone and walked away to take the call. He returned a few minutes later.
We found a guy who fit our description off of Hampton and South Street. The same needle gun and mask were found on him. 15 rounds of syringe ammo as well. It looks like he didn't resist arrest and has been cooperating with the officers. Buster's in the interrogation room right now.
I quickly dialed my dad's number to find that he was outside the interrogation room. What's going on, Dad? I asked quickly. Did he say anything about Tracy?
The guy's around 5'11", Caucasian male. He was wearing dark clothes. I'm not sure if anyone has heard him talk before, but he has a rather deep voice. Very distinct. The son of a bitch won't confess to anything. He won't even tell us his name. I'll let you know if we get him to talk about Tracy.
What was he doing when they caught him? I asked, still curious about Sergei's disgruntled patient's story.
It seemed like he was there to buy heroin. Some guys around there said he was paying double or triple the street price. I'm glad they caught him when they did. It looked like he was preparing for another attack tonight.
A bittersweet feeling washed over. The Needleman was finally caught. However, I assumed the worst for Tracy. Several weeks, and he still hadn't turned up. I shivered as I imagined the Needleman disposing of his body in the bay. The weather was dark and foggy as Pat split up with Jenna, Sergei and I. Sergei and I dropped off Jenna, and then we began to walk home.
I don't think you'll need me here anymore, Christian,
he said as he offered his hand at my front door. Thanks for all your help, Sergei. I shook his hand and he gave me a firm pat on the back. I stumbled forward.
Good luck with everything, kid. I hope you find out what happened to your friend.
I nodded and returned a sad smile. I had a lot of questions for my dad during dinner that night. Why does it feel like there are so many loose ends, Dad? I asked. There's still no trace. We have no clue where Tracy is. I'm not sure what his motives are. Why Rebecca and Percy? What about their parents?
Christian!
My dad cut me off.
We are still looking into it. I'm sure more will come into light when we finally find his identity.
I paused for a second as his eyes tilted upwards in thought.
Maybe these attacks were less calculated than we thought. I don't know. I'll sit with the detectives tomorrow and get back to you, son.
The next day was just as hazy and dark as the one before. Strange dreams filled my brain. I watched as a needle slowly squeezed into my thigh, filling me with its putrid black sludge. I screamed and begged him to stop, but I couldn't move my body. He takes off his mask to reveal my dad, standing before me with a twisted grin.
Sorry, son. Citian needed to test their new medicine. It'll only hurt for a bit.
I woke up in cold sweats as I jumped up, screaming and frantically trying to pull out the non-existent needle. I calmed down after several deep breaths and reached over to grab my phone. I had a new group message with Jenna and Pat. Patrick Casey.
Hey guys, I was going to go to a small party tonight to celebrate the end of the semester. Feel free to come as well. I know it's been a tough year, so I figured it might be nice to unwind a bit.
I groaned to myself at the thought of hanging in a room full of strangers and the meaningless small talk that came with it. My mood was still perfectly glum from the past few months, so naturally, my plans included watching movies in my room while waiting for any information from my dad. Before I could finish typing out my thoughts, I see a reply from Jenna. Jenna Flynn. Sure, Pat, sounds like fun. I don't know if Christian and I have been to one college party all year. You'll come too, right, Christian? I groaned again and threw my pillow across the room, resigning myself to accompanying Jenna. Sure, guys. I guess I can make it out. They both hearted the message. Where is it, by the way? Patrick Casey. It's on the west side of campus, near the garden and Cheshire Square. We can meet at my dorm at around 8 p.m. and head over together. With my semester being completed and nothing else to occupy my time, my day dragged on, with not much else to do but check my phone and wait for any updates on Tracy. I spent most of the day staring at my computer screen, trying to occupy my mind. I finally heard something around 4 p.m. Dad, the detectives still haven't gotten a name or confession off the guy. They're doing a face scan soon. I'll let you know what comes up. Jenna met me at my house around 7 p.m. and we started our walk to campus. Isn't May supposed to be warm? I asked out loud, feeling the micro rain particles coating my face. And sunny too, Jenna added. Maybe we should have just stayed in and watched a movie. We've only been walking like 15 minutes, Jenna. It's not too late to flake, I laughed. After a few more minutes of walking, Jenna turned to me and asked, So, how come we haven't been on a date yet? My cheeks began to glow red. I struggled for a second to come up with a response. Didn't we just have a study date last week? I quipped. She grinned and shook her head. I mean a real one. How about tomorrow night? Wait, isn't it supposed to be my job to make the first move? You had like 10 years, buddy, she laughed. Okay, fair enough. Tomorrow night sounds good. How about we go to that Italian place downtown that you like? I would love that, she said warmly as she rested her head on my shoulder for a second. I felt a warmth swelling in my chest that, just for a second, erased all the negativity in my head. It even felt like the fog was beginning to clear up a little. We eventually made it to Stetson Hall and told Pat about our date. It's about time, he smiled as he clapped me on the back. There was a bit of sadness in his smile, but I couldn't quite place it. We had a few drinks at Pat's place and started the walk across campus to the party. The cosy feeling of the alcohol plus the excitement of my date with Jenna caused me to forget about Tracy and the Needleman for a little bit. It was nice to feel that weight off my shoulders. Around us, students seemed to be in good spirits as well. The police presence on campus had diminished significantly, replaced by the excited looks of other students getting ready to go to parties and events of their own. We finally neared the house, a few blocks into the college neighbourhood. The surrounding houses were also throwing parties, as evidenced by the music and coloured lights. We walked into the house. I saw the music and lights coming from downstairs, but there weren't too many other voices. I assumed it was still getting started. I gotta run to the bathroom, but it looks like the guys are downstairs, Pat said quickly as he shuffled across the main floor. Jenna and I made our way down the stairs. Just as we reached the bottom step, I noticed my phone had been buzzing in my pocket for a while and picked it up to see several messages from my dad. The last one read, "What is Pat's last name?" I replied, "Casey. Why, Dad?" "Christian. Get back home right now." Startled, I looked up at the entrance to the basement to see the light from upstairs disappear as a heavy metal door swung and was locked with a metallic clink. Jenna and I began to panic and ran back up to the door. We began to frantically pound on the door. I noticed Jenna's movements were slowing as her head started to bob up and down. I then noticed how drowsy I had become as well. My vision blurred once, and then everything went black. The next thing I remember was slowly waking up in the basement. It was a dingy concrete room, filled with miscellaneous tools and supplies. I saw many white masks in a stack, a small collection of weapon prototypes, and a medicine cabinet, filled with syringes. The only light came from a few dim bulbs on the ceiling. I tried to move, and noticed both my hands spread out to either side of me, shackled in place. I was standing up, but my feet were restrained as well. To my right, I saw Jenna crumpled up next to me, both of her feet also shackled and her hands cuffed behind her. She was still asleep. I began to panic and thrash, but there was no give in my restraints. "Jenna!" I tried to scream, but a muffled gurgle came out through the gag I felt in my mouth. My fear and panic began to rise. "Where the fuck is Pat?" It came out as another inaudible gurgle, off towards the other end of the room. The pale face and curly black hair of someone chained to the floor. "Tracy!" He was awake, but wasn't able to respond due to his own gag. He made a few sounds and pointed to his left. Out from the shadows of another room crept a man. His imposing frame was almost tall enough that he needed to crouch. He wore black pants and a long-sleeve black shirt. His face was wrinkled with grey and razor-thin lips. His black eyes, small and downturned, reflected a life of suffering. Though he wasn't wearing his signature white mask, I had no doubt in my head, as his ominous presence washed over me. This was the Needleman. An indescribable sensation of dread filled my core as I looked down to see a small medical cart at his side. It had several full syringes, saline solution, alcohol wipes, and many other supplies. My thrashing grew violent at this point, blood spilling down my ankles and hands. He tore open a small square labelled Purell and wordlessly walked towards me. I felt a slight cooling sensation as the alcohol touched my arm, just below my left bicep. Tears started flowing down my face. I began to hear Tracy scream, vaguely, in the background. I attempted to break my wrists as he returned with a small syringe filled with a cream-coloured liquid. There was no chance. They were bound too tightly. I began to pray to any god that would listen. "Please, someone help me! Dad, the cops, anyone! I did nothing to deserve this! Please don't!" I screamed through my gag. I started sobbing uncontrollably as I felt the small pinch of a needle piercing my flesh and the slight rush as the heroin flowed in my veins. It was amazing how quickly my grief began to evaporate. A euphoric peace replaced it. The best feeling I had ever felt in my life. I couldn't even remember why I was so upset in the first place, as I happily tilted my head forward. I noticed that Jenna had begun to stir, as I started to nod off. My fear returned tenfold when my eyes opened. Jenna had begun to repeat exactly what I was doing when I woke up. Her eyes were wide as saucers, tracing between me, the medical cart, and the Needleman, who had been sitting on the basement floor, waiting. He got up again and went to grab another syringe. I was almost too dazed to think at this point. My head bobbed towards Jenna. My love for her was still there, but my protective instinct to defend her was fading. I felt completely powerless and even apathetic. Part of me even wished she could feel how amazing it was. To my surprise, he walked over to me again. I heard Jenna unleash a guttural scream, but there was nothing she could do. He injected me again, and then went back to sit on the floor of the basement. By the time the third injection came, I understood exactly how heroin could destroy so many lives. It felt unbelievable, but not as euphoric as the first time. My only desire was to feel the same bliss I had just experienced. I started to hear a heavy banging on the door. Jenna and Tracy both screamed as loud as their gags would allow. Through my half-closed eyes, I saw the Needleman walk over and unlock both of the cuffs that held Tracy in place. He quickly jumped up and backed away into the opposite corner, but the Needleman made no attempts to chase him. He simply produced Tracy's handgun and slid it towards him on the ground. Tracy picked it up with trembling hands and shot the Needleman in the temple. Tracy took a few steps forward and shot the Needleman's crumpled mass again. I heard another loud bang from up the stairs and then fell unconscious. I awoke to sunlight streaming out of a hospital window, the ache of the worst hangover ever drumming in my skull. Jenna and my parents saw me wake up in an adjacent room and quickly walked in. I saw their eyes were red and puffy. I could also see Tracy in the waiting room. His face was much more taut than when I last saw him. "Are you feeling okay?" my mum sniffled. Her sniffles then turned into full-on sobbing. For a brief second, I didn't remember why I was there, until the events of the previous night came flooding back. "Are you okay, Jenna?" I croaked as I tried to get up. "Whoa, easy. Take it slow," my dad said in a hoarse voice. I looked up to see the grief on his face. This was the first time I had seen him cry in my life. "I'm fine," Jenna replied. "He didn't even touch me." I could hear the guilt in her voice. After a few hours, I was cleared to leave the hospital. I waited until the 5 of us made it back to my house before I began asking questions. My dad began. "So, you knew about Celia Duff, right? So Percy's mum was her doctor many years ago, and Rebecca's mum was her pharmacist. We dug up some hospital records to see that they overprescribed her opioid drugs after an accident, and neglected all signs of her spiralling drug problem." I nodded as I began to understand. "She died the next year from a heroin overdose." "So, the Needleman was—" "Her son, Alistair Duff," my dad finished. "Then, who did you guys catch off of Hampton Street?" "His brother, Daniel." "And Pat?" Tracy answered this time. "Patrick Casey was his cousin." I gasped. "That son of a bitch planned this whole thing! I brought him into our house! How much of our friendship was a fucking setup?" Tracy replied again, slowly. "Alistair wanted me to believe that Daniel and Pat had very little to do with his actions. I know that can't be true, but I think he was preparing for the legal aftermath here. The amount of evidence they could probably collect on either of them is minimal." My dad growled in anger, but remained silent. "He let you kill him! What did he kidnap you for?" They knew I was getting too close to exposing them and wanted me out of the picture. Alistair promised me that after his final plan unfolded, he would let me be the one to take his life. He didn't even mistreat me when I was down there. I was given enough to eat and a little mattress pad to sleep on. So it was some kind of vendetta against the doctors who let his mum die. Why go after Percy and Rebecca, not their parents? All he would say was that is the only way they could understand my pain. And why me? Jenna, who had been silently observing the conversation, began to cry. Tracy pursed his lips and shook his head. "I don't know." The following trial of Daniel Duff and Patrick Casey was one of the most convoluted and publicised in Doyle's history. I was told that Patrick was found in his dorm room and did not resist arrest. I stared up at him with malice as he sat next to me on the defendant's side of the room. After setting me up for an entire year, I didn't want to sit here and watch some lawyers and a jury deliberate his sentence. I wanted him dead. He never made eye contact with me once. The lawyers that had represented the defendants were sharp and decisive. When they broke down the timeline of the Needleman's attacks over the last 18 months, there was little definite proof of Daniel and Patrick's involvement in the crimes. Even my dad's best lawyers were struggling to make a good case. When Alistair attacked Percy, reports claimed there was another person with him. That made Daniel a co-conspirator. When Rebecca was attacked, it appeared that Alistair acted alone. Tracy's disappearance, Tracy and I tried our best to make the case that Patrick was involved in his kidnapping. He was with us that night and conveniently went home with just enough time to alert his cousins. Again, he happened to have an airtight alibi. With no concrete evidence, the full blame of the kidnapping fell, once again, on Alistair. Impersonating the Needleman, Daniel's lawyers made a strong argument that it is not illegal to carry a white mask, and carrying heroin was hardly punishable by law. The only charge that could be made was obstructing justice. Finally, Jenna and my kidnapping. The lawyers argued that Pat was coerced into setting us up. This made him a co-conspirator, but the kidnapping charge fell, once again, on Alistair. After weeks of trial, the final charges were Daniel Duff, accessory to assault with a deadly weapon, obstruction of justice, harbouring a fugitive, 27 years. Patrick Casey, accessory to kidnapping, obstruction of justice, harbouring a fugitive, 19 years. And that was it. The national media attention died down after the mystery was solved. Everyone went about their lives. For good this time. Well, everyone but me. The trauma from that night stayed with me. The curse of addiction too. "What did you do to him, Dad?" I asked on our drive from the courtroom. "The other guys directly played a part in ruining his family. You haven't done anything like that. You didn't even know him or his mum." My dad turned to me, a look of compassion and grief in his eyes. "I don't know. Whatever his motive was won't change anything now. We will get through this, Christian. I promise." I wouldn't wish my next few years on anyone. Well, maybe Patrick. I didn't return to school the following year. I began working a part-time job instead, making just enough money to afford my next fix. I was a functional addict for some time. I tried my best to hide my drug use from everyone and continue on as if nothing ever happened. Jenna found out within a few days after she noticed my attitude change. My parents found out soon after that too. Unable to hide my drug use any longer, I began to distance myself from everyone close to me. I eventually ran away from home for a while. I overdosed twice after that and miraculously survived both times. I distinctly remember seeing my dark, sunken eyes in a mirror at the rehab centre. That moment was when I decided enough was enough. I stared into the black pool of weak coffee in the styrofoam cup I was holding. In my peripheral vision was a circle of black plastic chairs around me, about 15 people. All of their eyes were fixated on me. Some displayed horror, some pity. One of them, a blonde woman with wrinkled skin, was looking down at the floor. For years, contemplating my revenge was the only thing that kept me sane. I had counted down the days until Patrick's release so I could, I didn't know what I would do. That seething rage somehow dissipated more and more as each day passed. For some reason, I just couldn't handle the burden of it anymore. I made the conscious choice one day to leave that part of my past behind me and focus every ounce of strength I had on getting clean. Quitting heroin was the hardest thing I've ever done. I'll never be free from addiction, nor will I forget the circumstances that made me an addict. But with the support of my loved ones, and after years of failure, I stared down at the enamel 6 on the small bronze coin in my other hand. I've been sober for 6 years, as of today. The group clapped lightly as we ended the session of Narcotics Anonymous. "I'm so proud of you," Jenna smiled as she picked me up. I kissed her and reminded her I couldn't have done it without you. "Yeah, I know," she laughed as we began our drive out of the medical centre and to my parents' house for dinner. It had been 10 years since I was attacked by Alistair, but Doyle felt radically different from what it was like before. We passed through Hampton Street. Gone were the rows of tattered tents. It now held a small elementary school. Seeing the struggle I went through did something to my dad. His outlook on addicts changed almost overnight. In fact, he did exactly what he promised in his one-on-one interview with Sandra Mayers: create and implement a pragmatic approach to rehabilitation. By the end of year 2 in his second term, the construction of the world-class Keith Medical Centre was complete. It was designed from the bottom up to help those in recovery with a mix of behavioural therapy, methadone treatment, and city-funded rooms to help keep users off the streets. By the end of Year 3, the City of Doyle implemented the Recovery Rooms program at every major hotel in the city. This program helped homeless people transition from living on the streets to living in hotel rooms across the city. As unpopular as that idea initially was, it worked out extremely well. People recovering from homelessness were given a warm, safe place to stay. They had a much better chance at recovering when away from other users. Hotel guests didn't even notice them, since there was only about 1 in every 20 rooms. By the end of his term, regulations were passed that strictly limited the ability of doctors to prescribe opioid drugs. NSAID pain relievers and cannabis were positioned as replacement options. My parents greeted Jenna and I warmly as we arrived. "Hey guys, so nice to see you. Congratulations, Christian." "Thanks guys, check out my coin." I pulled the bronze anniversary coin out of my pocket. We ate and talked about the past few years, reminiscing about days gone. Everyone was excited to hear I had begun going back to school part-time for engineering. My dad told us how he had started volunteering at the hospital, helping recovering addicts find their best treatment options. We finished our dinner and said our goodbyes. Jenna was quiet for several minutes on the ride home. As we passed the revamped Hampton Street again, she finally pointed out of the window and asked me, "Christian, do you think this is what Alistair wanted?"